To simulate what I wanted to simulate, basically how long it would take me to do a full report, and to see if it was enough in 24 hours as I thought, or I would need more time, or maybe less. What I needed to do is grab an example of something that I've done in the past and try to create something at least similar to it. That way I could have a reference of how long it took me in the past, or how long I budgeted in the past, and how long it's going to take me. The first step, like any other report in Power BI, is to gather data, gather any permissions that I may need to be able to access that information, go through cybersecurity, all that fun stuff. I cannot simulate that, so the alternative was how long it was going to take me to find good data that I could actually use for a report, where I could have a fact table and different dimension tables. And that way, all that time that I would lose in meetings with different people to get access and go through cybersecurity, stuff like that can happen. All of that time would be substituted through looking in different websites and trying to find different data sets. At the end, I ended up finding 3 data sets. So one of them is related to hotels, is a hospitality business in India, if I'm not wrong. And they have the numbers of the revenue and also the bookings and all the information related to any of those 2 things. The other one that I found was a retail store or an e-commerce. I'm not 100% sure. The information doesn't tell me any difference between each other. And what I basically did is use that data and think that that information was any store that was inside the hotel. If you go to big hotels, they have their part of the real estate, of the rooms that you can book, but also they also have rooms, they also have shops where you can shop around, get a swimsuit or an ice cream or any other thing. And finally, like any good business, I look for information on the customer experience, and there wasn't much information that I could find, but I managed to find at least one data set that had surveys with their answers and the value from 0 to 10, so that we can at least do some calculations on NPS. Once we have the data, the thing that I needed to do is that all of that data was not connected between each other, so they were completely independent data sets. So I needed to modify that information a little bit. What I did is basically go to Excel and change some of the fields. For example, fields like the region or anything related to a country. I changed everything to US, and the reason for that is because the information I had on the e-commerce store was having way more dimension tables and things like that. So it was easier for me to just adapt the other data sets that didn't have any dimension tables. And then I would create those dimension tables on a separate location. So I adapted all the information that I had on the 3 different data sets. That way I can relate each one of them, and they are all interconnected between each other. The next thing that we did, and it's something that I see many people forget when they start any type of reporting solution, is create a mockup. If you start right away trying to build directly the report with the information that you have, creating all the connections to the data sets, creating all the measures that you need and all of that, something is going to happen. You did a lot of work and none of it is exactly what they wanted. In order to bypass that, what I always do, and that's something that many people can take advantage of and also do, is create a mockup. That mockup is nothing else than a PowerPoint that simulates what is going to be the structure of the report, what can they find based on the information that they have. And basically, the customer will be able to have an idea and be like, hey, I don't want to see the profit, I just want to see the margin, or I don't want to see the number of bookings, I just want to see how many people are coming in and out. All those different things that you need to have in a conversation. If you have a mock-up, it's easier to talk because you're basically talking on top of something instead of just grabbing a list of thousands of measures or metrics that they tell you that they want to have, and then it's up to you to decide how that is going to be organized. This way you create something that doesn't take much time, that the information doesn't need to be the right information, you just need to put the right titles and the right graphs, and your customer is going to be able to tell you, hey, I don't want this, I want that, change that, the colors I don't like them, the letters I don't like them, make sure that this has X amount of commas, or it's in millions, or it's in thousands, all of that stuff that will take you more time. That's a good kickstart for the project, and that way you make your projects go a little bit smoother and a little bit faster. It's also very useful for any freelance, because you can always go and be like, hey, this is the mockup. Do we agree on everything that is in the mockup? Your customer says yes, then you can start developing, and you just develop whatever is in the mockup. There's always going to be changes, but at least you have a closed project, which is not always 100% closed, but it's the closest you can get to a closed project. Now, this mockup, what I did, this is still on the first day. I started to create this mockup. I didn't create the whole thing. It took me at least until the beginning of the second day to create all of this. It's nothing fancy, but it's enough for me to sit down and have a conversation with a potential client, or with the client that I have at the moment. And what I did to simulate that is I basically sat down with my girlfriend and started showing her what I had. She purposely told me some changes that needed to be done and things that she didn't like, things that she found that were missing. It's just to get a reference of having, I don't know, a 30-minute call with a client or a 1-hour call with a client, and then telling you that they need this change or that change or the other change. Once I was done with the mockup took me until the more or less mid-morning of the second day. So I was already around 10, 12 hours into this. Once we had the mockup, I could really start on the actual development. The first thing that I did is create all the connections to the database, and let me show you all the information that I did. Because the information that I was having had different formats. Some of them were a single table with no dimensions. Others were a fully compact table with all the fact information, but also the dimensions included in the same table. And another one was an Excel file that had different tabs, and each one of those tabs were the different dimension tables that we may need on our report. What I did is segregate all the information from all the fact tables. That way I could make sure I only had the data that I want in the fact tables and no dimensions. I created separate dimension tables based on those original tables. This, in theory, you shouldn't need to do it in Power BI. This would come already from the database that you're using, but as it is a good practice and a standard practice to do in all your reports, I did it because I think it's easier to work with all of those dimension tables, and it's the way it's supposed to be done. Now, as any other project, I had to modify different things on my data. Those were some of the things I had to modify. I also created a calendar table. That way, all the information I could relate to all the dates that I had on the different tables. And what I did is that the information that I had was for different years in each one of the data sets. So I grabbed the one that had more dates. I grabbed that, I don't know, I think it was from 2014 to 2017. So I grabbed all the dates from those 3 years and went to the other tables, substitute their dates with those dates. That way everything can match on the same years, and it's easier to compare as it would be in an actual report. Again, this is a simulation, so all of this information is not related between each other. So I created those dimension tables. Basically what I did is duplicate the original table, then remove everything that I didn't need, remove all the duplicates, and I could have those dimension tables. Then I could go back to the fact tables and remove all of those dimensions that are not needed anymore so that the model has less information. I also did a couple changes on the data types, so things like dates or currencies that needed to be included there, and I think that's about it. Yeah. With all of those connections to the different information, all the changes in the data, that took me not long, but it's something that you need to do thoroughly. You need to really think of what you're doing. And that took me around almost the end of the second day. At the end of the second day, I was able to start already with the measures. I started working already on all the measures that we need. You can see there's plenty of them. And for sure, we could include way more measures than the ones I have here. This is just the ones I could think of. Again, this was all done out of my mind, so it could change in each one of the different projects that we may have. Now, all the measures that we have here, some of them are simple. The more complex one may be the next week check-ins, where I basically was looking at everything that was checking in or checking out on the following week. And for that, I created a selected date, which is basically a given date that I can change whenever I want on the report. The idea for this is that usually you would do with today's date, but the data being that it's from at least 7 years ago, I cannot use that. So I created a random date inside all the information that I have so that it could act as the today's date. Now with that today's date, I could calculate all those next check-ins and check-outs so that we know how many rooms are coming in or are going out. Other than that, other metrics that might be different are things like booking month to date or year to date. Nothing super fancy. They're relatively simple, but it's something to have in mind. The rest are things like sum of the whole column with some filters here and there, not much to see there, and then other metrics that are combinations of multiple metrics. Once I had the metrics and I had all the data, now it was the fun part, and it's basically developing the actual report. For that, and being that I had my mockup, I could honestly go quite fast. I thought it was gonna take me a little bit longer, but having the full mockup, and that's why I always do it, it went by quite quickly. So I could create all the different tabs that I needed based on the mockup that I had, without any type of slicer, without any type of button or connections or tooltips or any of those not advanced but different things that may take a little bit longer to create. So what I did is kept a really clean format, making sure that we don't have a lot of information. One mistake I see many people do is create dashboards that are long and that you have to scroll down or even zoom in and zoom out. That's zero efficient. The customer experience, your user experience basically, is going to be really bad. And in my experience, those reports tend to be forgotten eventually. Now, while keeping that simple, there are things like the backgrounds. The backgrounds are nothing else than shapes that are constant on all the tabs. That way, you always have this feeling that you know where you are, you know that you're in this report, and it's not changing on each tab. It changes the way they are organized, yes. So if you go to retail, for example, I think it changes. So we have a longer one in the bottom here, a smaller one, and if you go to customer experience, there's even less information because there was less information on the data sets that I had. The next step was, once I had the whole structure of the report, was to actually have all the visualizations. I created the first 4 visualizations and I used the formatting of all of those for all the different graphs and all the different visualizations that we had on the rest of the report. This way, everything is consistent. I tried to use a color palette that had a little bit of contrast with the background, but also was not going to be too much in your face. Colors is something that depends a lot on each person. If you're colorblind, there may be some selection of colors that are not the best for you. Maybe somebody that is colorblind is going to have some difficulty looking at this MPS graph. So what I tend to do, and in this case, I just had to look for color palettes, but what I tend to do is grab the corporate colors that they have on the company that I'm working for and use those, because usually that has been studied a little bit better than just 5 minutes before starting the report. If you use the color palette, you can always use those more clear colors of the same exact colors, things like less light or stuff like that, or more white. In Spanish, we call them pastel, basically the same color but lighter or darker, and that way you can have some contrasting. Like here, the letters are in blue, the background is also in blue but it's lighter, and the background of everything is even more lighter but it's still in blue. With all the graphs created, and this took me around first half of the last day, until here I could have said that I had everything that I wanted to have for a very simple report. Let's be honest, this is not something super fancy. It's a very simple report that is really well organized with all the information that you may need, no more, no less. From there, we could start having things like tooltips, buttons that move you around, or other things that you may think of. So buttons that we have on the homepage, and if you create a homepage, you need to use buttons, otherwise it makes no sense. By the way, all of these HVG images, I had to look for them around. I was a little bit on a rush, so you can see the corners. I could not get rid of the corners. I'm not a Photoshop expert. So yeah, that's something that could be fixed with a little bit more of time. But basically, each one of them is a different button that it will take you to a different part of the report. So if we click to overview, it takes you to the overview. And here we have things like the tooltips for the different graphs. This is basically showing you the same exact information with one deeper filtering level, to say it somehow. So in this case, if I was looking at the total revenue by the hotels, I could check the different regions, which one is bringing me more revenue. The same with the profit. I would have the different regions telling me which one is bringing more profit. And for the bookings, I think it's the exact same tooltip. Yes, it's telling me all the bookings that we have by region, and the same with the MPS that you could see is the one that changes the most. I did something similar in hotels, changed some of those tooltips. For example, here, if I'm not wrong, we have a different type of tooltip. This is basically going to tell me these are all the bookings that we have in each one of the properties that we have, and for whatever day that we are looking into. I'm not sure if we have other tooltips, the similar one that we had before, and I think that's about it. We also have some slicers on the top, so if you want to look only for the central data, you can see always the central data. If you want to look for a specific location, you can always select a specific location. All these slicers are synchronized, so if you go to overview, you have the same exact slicer, and whatever is selected in one of them, it's going to apply to all of them. Again, things that are relatively simple to have, but if you have to create something relatively quick, you have to have those in mind. Other things that we created, we have this graph. Basically, it's just to show some functionalities. You could change this table by something else. What I did is that if you click top or bottom, it's going to organize the product list based on how much revenue they bring. So if I come here and I come to bottom, now it's the one that brings the least revenue. If I click to top, it's the one bringing the most revenue. The tooltip is basically showing the information that it has, the description of the product. And yeah, that's about it. The last one is the customer experience. You'll see that this one is the least complex one. Basically, is the one that I have less information. So what I did is create the NPS, quite a standard metric, percentage of promoters minus percentage of the tractors. Show it on a you can have the trend over time. You can also see it here by year. If you look by day, doesn't make much sense. You can always filter a little bit lower if I have that information, yes, or higher if you want to go by month. This is probably easier to read, so you can always play with those filterings. And the same here, divided by region, so you can see which regions are performing better and worse. And an overall segregation, an overall pie chart that is showing you what percentage of promoters we have, the tractors, and so on. This is standard. This is something that people look into. It's just a reference number that you want to have in your mind, that you know that, hey, usually out of 100 surveys, we have 50% of them being promoters and the rest being detractors and passive. If you want to do some quick calculation, it's a nice number to have in your head. All the other tabs are basically the different tooltips that I needed for each one of the graphs that we have. And although some of these look exactly the same, the measure that it's used in all of them is different, because it will be dependent on whatever graph is it inputted on. So if I'm showing bookings, I'm not going to use a tooltip that is going to show you revenue. Would make no sense. It might be in some cases that that's what you want to reflect, but wasn't the case here. Once we have this whole report, the next step that I didn't do is publish. You'll publish this to your online service, and if all this information is in databases, especially if they're in the cloud that you can access through the cloud, or if you need a gateway, you can always get a gateway, create one and access to it. You would publish this and create those connections. I didn't do that because all of this information is in Excel, so it wouldn't make sense for me to create it. It's already online on the cloud, on my cloud, and the connection will be really straightforward, nothing fancy to do there, so it was just 10 minutes after publishing. This could be all automated. And that's about it. Honestly, it took me a little bit less than I thought it would take me. But it also tells you how easy or complicated it is to create one of these solutions when you have no reference whatsoever from what the client wants. So it's completely free to create something already functional, but depends on your client. You will need to have different things. You will need to have more detail, more functionality, or less detail, less functionality. So to create an example out of the blue with a little bit of ideas of what you did on other reports in the past, but honestly with data you haven't worked before that has not much detail, because this is the best I could find. You could create better things, but I think I've seen way worse reports than this one also. So that's a good thing to think about. Overall, the whole report took me around, I would say, 18 hours to create, not 24, which is good. It means I'm not losing money, which is a good thing to have in mind. But yeah, again, there's a lot more that it could be done. Usually the part that it takes the longest is the first part, finding the data, getting the access, making sure that you're pulling the right information. That's something that I try to simulate the best I could here. I took a lot of time to look into the information, look into different data sets. And even with that, I feel like it went by way too quickly. Usually you have to have several calls with several people to make sure you're using the right information and all of that, to understand the information that you're getting, things like that. This wasn't the case here, and I think that's the part of time that I think it was faster than it should be. The rest, it was quite accurate, because once you have the data, it's up to me to create that mockup, have a little bit of conversations with the clients, then create the report based on the mockup that we have decided. So the rest is quite a normal behavior of how one of these developments would go.